Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's time for the boy! Since 2016, I've remade this drawing of my character Silver every 2 years. The last time I did it was in 2020, meaning it's time for a new one. I set a really high bar for myself with the last one. That one was like huge improvement from the previous version in 2018, so let's see how this one turns out by comparison. As usual, I started by making a bunch of little sketches to figure out the pose. The first idea had him with his bow drawn and aimed at the viewer, kind of like the 2018 version had. But I was sure pretty early on that I wanted the energy for this version of the painting to be a bit different from the previous ones. I wanted this version to match the current conception of the character. Silver is supposed to be a formidable and sort of dangerous hunter, but he's also someone who avoids other people and, more importantly, conflict. It doesn't really make sense for him and his personality to just stare someone down or threaten them with his bow. He would much rather just avoid you entirely. That meant for this version of the painting, he wouldn't be making eye contact with a viewer. Instead, I wanted a painting of him sort of going about his day hunting, with the camera being sort of just like an imaginary camera observing what he's doing rather than an actual viewer like the other images had. I experimented with a whole bunch of different poses from different angles, with different levels of energy, some more like careful and alert, others actively shooting at something, but eventually I ended on this one. It's a relatively similar pose to the 2020 version, with the important difference that he isn't staring down and actively threatening the viewer, but instead he's after something else. I like the general vibe of this pose, but I wasn't quite happy with how it looked as an image, so I tried to figure out a way to push it to make it a bit more dynamic and interesting. To achieve that, I decided to really push the perspective. I put the camera low to the ground and had one foot really close to it and one further back to kind of have this very cool angle looking up at him with a lot of foreshortening and everything. And I really liked the direction that idea was heading. However, I posted the sketch to a group of friends for some critique, and they pointed out that the perspective and the pose were looking a little bit broken, and looking back, I can totally see what they meant. So I opened up Blender. I decided to model a really quick and dirty 3D sort of puppet kind of thing that I could use to pose to make sure the perspective and everything would make sense in the final image. I added in spheres and sculpted them to make the bigger rounder shapes like the head, chest, and hips, and then used a skin modifier setup to make all the longer bits like the snout, ears, and limbs. For that, I added a plane which I merged down into a single vertex. Then I added a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier. From there, I could just extrude the vertices and use ctrl+a to scale the individual points to adjust the thickness. I also added a mirror modifier to most of these pieces with a pivot set to the torso so that it would automatically flip everything over and I could make sure the proportions looked right. For this little puppet thing, I made sure that each piece of the body was a separate object, with the origin set as close as possible to where I think the joint should be. That way I could pose it later like an actual rigged model. I also used the grease pencil to draw on a face just to use as a rough guide later. Once I was happy with the general proportions of everything, I removed all the mirror modifiers and then used an empty as a temporary parent to duplicate over the limbs from one side to the other. Simply scaling the objects to -1 on the x-axis wouldn't have worked because they had a rotation that was not 0. Finally, I parented each segment to the next segment up using ctrl+p so that I could move the whole thing like a rig. I also, of course, added a bow and later an arrow because those were sort of vital for this character and the pose. And now I can start posing him. Using these separate objects parented to each other with the origins at the joints isn't quite as versatile as using an actual rig, but for a quick puppet like this, it really works well. I posed the character similarly to how I had drawn him originally. but now with the added ability to make sure that he wasn't turning his head in some kind of weird unnatural way like he was in the sketch. I was also able to try out a bunch of different camera positions and adjust the focal length to really get the most out of the whole angle and perspective that I was going for. I also added in some trees since they needed to match his perspective, and seeing as I had a 3D model anyway, I messed around with the lighting a bit to use that as reference for the painting too. With a drastic perspective like this, it's actually quite difficult to estimate where which part of the model is facing, so having a 3D lighting reference like this is really helpful. With a bit more messing around and tweaking, I ended up with this render that I could take back into Krita to continue the actual painting. I roughly traced over the render in order to make a new, much better sketch. I didn't stick too closely to the actual outlines of the render, since it was very rough and blobby and didn't have any anatomy or anything. I also wanted to make sure that the outline of the sketch had a bit of a variety in terms of curves and hard edges, which wasn't something I paid much attention to while making the model. I also had to add in quite a few details that I had missed out while making the model itself, like the hands. I kind of regret not just grabbing a model of hands I had lying around somewhere and posing that, because boy were the hands difficult in this perspective. I worked on them a lot early on around here, but I spent another couple of hours later while rendering trying to get the pose to work right. I also had a bit of trouble with the face since this isn't an angle I draw faces from very often, and I didn't go into really any amount of detail on the 3D model except for the quick grease pencil sketched on face. But those are things that I'm going to have to figure out later while working on the render. For now, I trace over everything that I have in the 3D model and add in the extra details that I feel are necessary. With the basic sketch done, I add in a pass of the basic light and shadow on the character. Having messed around with the lighting on the 3D model made this process a lot quicker and more straightforward, since I didn't have to spend any amount of time deciding on where I wanted the light to come from, and I had a very accurate picture of where the light would be hitting and where I would have shadows. Usually it takes a lot of thinking and trying to visualize your sort of planes and shapes in 3D, but since I already had a 3D, I didn't have to do all of that in my head. I could just use the reference I had already made for myself. With those rough shadows in place, I added in a basic pass of color, and then messed around a bit more with the lights and shadows in order to get a decent composition. I also go back into the light and shadows that I had already made, add a bit more color, and start blending things together and adding in some of the finer details. At this point, I also added in the extra pieces that I didn't include in the 3D model. Specifically, his little side belt pouch thing, the strap of his quiver, the sort of armor shin guard bits around his legs, and two asymmetrical gloves/vam braces on his arms. One protects his index and middle finger from the bowstring, while the other protects his forearm from also the bowstring when it snaps back if he shoots the bow. At this point, all the pieces of the image are in place, and the only thing left to do is a whole bunch of tweaking and rendering and adding detail. I use the color picker to pick colors from what I've already laid down to move them around and blend between different colors, And occasionally I use extra layers with settings like overlay to add in a few extra colors before merging them down and again going on and like blending and tweaking. For this particular painting, I used a bunch of different layers to separate different pieces of the painting. For example, I made separate layers for the bow and the bowstring, and later on I also made a whole bunch of extra layers for the arrow, all the like leather bits of gear he's wearing, and even the hands when I took some time to work on them separately. I have the brushes I used linked in the description below. I found a couple really nice ones that have a bit of color jitter on them that really help add a bit of variation and vibrancy and just like texture to the rendering process. While rendering, I try as much as possible to start with big brush strokes and then move on to smaller and smaller ones later in the places that require that, though that didn't work out quite as well with this painting as it has with a couple of others in the past. I think it was especially because there were so many like small pieces that had separate colors and textures, or just pieces that had the same colors and textures but were overlapping, so I couldn't just use one big brush stroke to kind of go over both. Either way though, I think the brushwork ended up pretty fine. Not the best brushwork I've done, I think that would go to the painting of Blaze I did a while ago, but it's still alright. One relatively significant difference I've noticed between this painting and the one in 2020 is that I've gotten a bit more confident with the colors. For the previous one, I stuck to relatively desaturated, cool, almost grayish blues for most of the painting, and I kept the leather straps really desaturated, almost gray. While for this one, I have a lot more brighter blue bounce light from the snow, even though the snow isn't actually that blue, and the leather parts are going towards even an orange in some places. They're definitely a very warm, saturated brown. This is a thing where I don't actually think this version is better than the last one, but instead their different color schemes sort of match the different moods they have. The previous one was way more threatening and like dark, so the desaturated, serious colors really made sense for it. While this one has a lot more of an exciting, adventurous feel to it, where the slightly more desaturated colors and the more obviously complementary color scheme with the warm brown contrasting with the cold blues really matches a slightly brighter mood. Of course, this isn't like a super bubbly happy painting, but his look is a lot more concentrated and focused as opposed to like angry or threatening or like looking to fight someone. At this point, I had started using separate layers to really pin down the proportions and lighting on the different pieces of the character, and it had become time to address the hands again. As I said, I kind of regret not including some hands in the 3D model. That would have really helped me with the perspective at this point, but I hadn't, so I have to work with what I have. I had a whole bunch of images of other people doing archery in similar poses to use as references, and I even took some pictures of my own hands in these poses, but I still didn't quite get the hands particularly good. I think the front hand ended up alright, though I'm not quite happy with how the index finger looks on that one, and the back hand is like all kinds of a mess. I think the thumb is in a slightly wrong position. Who knows, maybe I'll go back and change it at some point. Probably not. Once I've finished a painting, I usually don't go back and change anything about it. Either way, I guess this is a sign that I should take a bit of time to study hands and get a better feel for how they work. At this point, the character is in a place I'm pretty happy with, so I take some time to work on the background a bit more. I add a bit more texture to the snow and add some extra bits and bobs lying around on the ground. I wanted the whole thing to look like a natural forest clearing bit as opposed to a deliberately built path. The brushes I used while painting the snow had a bit of color jitter and a lot of texture to them, which really made the snow feel very textured and cold and fluffy. I also took some time to add a bit more color and texture to the trees in the background, as well as a bit of a layer of snow that's kind of blown against them. For the 2020 version, the trees in the background had this very graphical, hard-edged, gradient kind of look to them, which turned out pretty cool, but it wasn't something that I had planned to do. It sort of happened because I struggled to get the tree textures and stuff to look good, and it caused a bit of a weird disconnect between the background trees and the foreground environment, which was way more painterly and matched the style of the character. Either way, that kind of an emergency improvised tree design wouldn't have worked well for this painting, so I'm really happy that the more painterly trees matching the style of the character worked out as well as they did here. I've always struggled blending the tree trunks into the ground and up into sort of the canopy, and that turned out really well in this painting. The snow coming up from the ground helped tie the bottom of the trees to the ground, and at the top I just sort of went with a very blurry implied look for the canopy and just had the tree trunks disappear into this mess of undefined branches and stuff like that, and it worked out really well, I think. And finally, the last thing I did to really tie this piece together was add a bit of atmosphere. I used a really textured brush to add a bit of snow into the background, and a big soft fluffy one to add this haze over the ground. It's supposed to be this sort of fog or fine snow that's being swept up by the wind, and alongside some extra hazy wind lines, I'm gonna call them, I used them to push the composition of the image more in the direction I want. I used the sort of lines from the wind to accentuate this kind of triangular shape, which is the center of the composition, and because the haze reduces the contrast around the lower body, it means that the face against the dark background is really the center of attention in the whole image. And with those final details added and a bit of cropping and some color correction, the painting is complete. And here's the finished piece. And aside from the hands, I'm really happy with how it turned out. It was quite a scary painting to approach just because of how good the 2020 version was, and also because I had to find time to work on the painting while also having school. I did a little bit of work on it on my laptop during lectures, but I didn't really have the resources there I needed to really work on it very well, so I had to do most of the work at home. That meant the whole process was spread out really far, I think over a month, which is a long time for me to work on one painting. I tend to lose my flow or focus or interest in an artwork if I've spent too much time away from it. But fortunately, I managed to get my flow back and finish up the painting, and it turned out really nice. This time there isn't as much of a drastic difference as there was between the 2020 and 2018 version, but looking at the two, there's definitely still some improvement. It's not as immediately striking because of the lack of eye contact, but I think the dynamic perspective and just the general atmosphere really makes up for it. The way he's holding his bow also makes a lot more sense in this one. I have never done archery proper, but I have shot a bow a couple of times. So for someone who taught himself how to hold a bow, his arm positioning makes a lot more sense in this one than it did last time. Anyway, here are all the different versions together. Let me know which ones you like the most and what you think of the changes that have made over the years. I'm looking forward to drawing him again in another 2 years. I really enjoyed the process this time despite it being a bit messy, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video as well. Anyway, that's been all from me for today. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and take a look down in the description below for more interesting stuff from me. That all being said, I hope you guys have a nice day, and see you all next time.